Good evening, everyone. And first of all, can I say thank you very much for coming. It's one of the real pleasures, one of the highlights of the kind of year here at Southampton is the Wellington lecture. I'm now coming into my fifth year as Vice-Chancellor, and we've had some really fascinating talks, and we're very pleased that you've come along to be part of that, because clearly an audience is a key element. So my name's Mark Smith, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at Southampton University. And it's a great pleasure to see everyone, and we're really pleased that, as ever, His Grace, the Duke of Wellington, has given his evening up to come with us and is a huge supporter of this event, which really makes us so thank you, Your Grace, for coming along. This is the 34th Wellington lecture, so it's been going for some time, and it was established. You can do the maths. Which year? No, it was it was established in 1989 by the former Chancellor, who was Lord Jellicoe, with an endowment from the Spanish ambassador. And we're very broad-minded about the kind of topic, because clearly the Duke is known for some key elements of history, but his impact on life not only in Britain but also more broadly across the world, particularly Europe, was very far-reaching. So we've had some lectures that have covered broad areas of the influence of the Duke of Wellington, a huge political figure in the 19th century. And the other reason we host this event, as I'm sure you know, is that we are very proud to be the home and house the papers of the Duke of Wellington, which are here in our archives. In fact, if you haven't been, there's a current exhibition on which features some of the papers in the archives in a more public space. So please go along and look at that, because we've just been lucky to have a tour of that. They're totally fascinating collection. And so tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Tony Pollard, who's from the University of Glasgow, to deliver this 34th Wellington lecture. And Tony has directed the battlefield and conflict-related projects across the UK, Europe, Africa and South America, and his interests range from 18th century warfare, particularly in relation to the Jacobite wars in Scotland. But obviously, I don't know. That's telling me I'm supposed to get off. But tonight he's going to talk about obviously some of his work in relation to the battlefield at Waterloo, and it's fascinating because talking to Tony beforehand, this kind of interface between history and archaeology, particularly of something of that era, is something that I know nothing about. So I'm looking forward to learning about it tonight. So it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce the 34th Wellington lecturer tonight, Professor Tony Pollard, who's going to talk to us about the aftermath, 1815 and beyond, battlefield clearance and archaeology at Waterloo. Tony.
That was my phone. Let's put that on silent, shall we? It's trouble. Good evening, everyone. It's a delight to be here. I'm always happy to talk about Waterloo Uncovered, and the work we do there. I'd just like to thank Dr. Anna Collar for inviting me to give this prestigious lecture. Anna and I first met many years ago in a rock-cut tomb on the Syrian-Turkish border. So archaeology does get you around, but we're going to be looking at a few square miles of Belgium over the next 50 minutes, and so here we go. This is the living, breathing Waterloo Uncovered. That was last year. We were slightly smaller in number than this year, but we have an amazing mix of archaeologists, archaeology students, historians, and military veterans and still serving military personnel. And Mark Evans and Charlie Fournette, both like naughty schoolboys, are in the back row there, I see. When they first invited me to take part in this project, when it was just a pipe dream in 2014, just in time for the 200th anniversary the next year, it wasn't so much Waterloo that grabbed my attention, it was working with military veterans, because I was already edging that way, working with veterans from the Falklands War of 1982. We've since started a project in the Falklands, but that is very much another story. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is very much based on the archaeology and the history. And here, I guess, that the first part of this talk will lead me into how I started to think about the events that we were looking at archaeologically. And there are a couple of trigger warnings here. One is that I will be showing images of human remains, but they are skeletal. The other, Your Grace, is that there will be a traffic cone. But, you know, you can take the lad out of Glasgow, but... So we shall, without further ado, now what I'm not going to do, and what we do not have time to do, obviously, is go through the history of the battle. We could be here for the rest of the week with that. So what I'm going to do is focus on two elements. Now, just to give you a very brief idea, we've got the Anglo-Allies under Wellington in red on the ridge to the north and the slope leading down to the south. And we've got Napoleon's French army on a lower rise to the south. So Wellington is protecting and covering the road to Waterloo, to Brussels, which is about 10 miles beyond the town of the village of Waterloo. But what I'm going to look at here is one of the three farms which sit forward of Wellington's main line and provided vital strong points throughout the battle. And these are sites you've probably all heard of. In the centre, we've got La Haye-Saint, which the French took late in the day, around 6 p.m. It was probably the high watermark of Napoleon's effort. I can see my slide behind a white screen. I'm not sure what's happening there. So La Haye-Saint falls, and to the left there is Papelotte, and Papelotte is to the east, so that's where the Prussians ultimately arrive and join with Wellington's army. But on Wellington's right, we have the farm of Hougoumont, which is probably the most famous of the three. And Hougoumont was defended by the Anglo-Allies throughout the day of the battle. It was one of the first points of engagement, maybe around about 11, half 11 in the morning. And we've got German, we've got Dutch German, and we've got British troops there. Famously the Foot Guards, both 1, 2, and I have to remind some of my colleagues, number 3, the Scots Guards. And that became, quite naturally, I think, the initial focus for our investigation. Charlie and Mark are both very closely related to the Coldstream Guards. Mark is a veteran, Charlie is still serving, a lieutenant colonel. And so it was natural that Hougoumont became our first focus of archaeological attention in 2015, just after the period of the celebrations. We spent quite a while picking up material that thousands of reenactors had dropped on the battlefield. To this day, around 75% of all the buttons that we pick up are modern replicas, dropped by, which is interesting in its own right, but at times becomes slightly irritating. But the first thing that struck me about Waterloo was the level of preservation. And I often say, if Waterloo had been fought anywhere in Britain, it would now be covered by light industrial units, railways, and what have you. I point you to Bannockburn, one of my old sites in Scotland, as an example. But here, as you can see, the ground is still fairly open. It retains that agricultural aspect. There is not a huge amount of building. Yes, we've got the freeway to the west, Brenneloo has expanded, but by and large, we're still looking at an open landscape. That doesn't mean the landscape is the same as it was in 1815. And some elements of that might come out through this, indeed they will. And one of the challenges of the project is examining the topography and how its character has changed over 200 plus years. So there we have Hougoumont, just forward of Wellington's right, which stretched around the ridgeline here. And of course, as you will know, many of his men were behind the ridge in what we call dead ground, out of sight of Napoleon's forces to the south. So we're going to look at Hougoumont, and then we're going to look at a farm I've not mentioned. It's not on the front line, it's to the rear, Mont Saint-Jean. And Mont Saint-Jean has really started to, again, change our understanding of the practicalities and the physicalities of this battle. But we'll start with Hougoumont. And Hougoumont, the example I'm going to use, is a fairly straightforward, though still very rare example of what we might call battlefield archaeology can achieve. So here is Hougoumont as it exists today, taken from the west. There you have the mound dedicated to the Prince of Orange. Famously, Wellington said words to the effect of, "They've ruined my battlefield," when he visited in 1826. He was a little more prosaic than that. I kind of like some of his snippets. He's a bit of an Oscar Wilde of the military world. But there are very few places on that battlefield where you can't see that mound. It's fantastic to stand on and look at, but of course you have a view from up there that nobody had at the time of the battle. And for us as historians and archaeologists, the vexating thing, as it was for Wellington, is that hundreds of tons of earth were scoured up in the 1820s to build that mound, which is actually covering a huge brick pillar with a lion pointing aggressively at France, a big bronze lion, obviously made from melted down French cannon, as you do. But we're concerned about the farm here, which was defended, both the courtyard and the buildings and the walled garden, and beyond it, though gone now, an orchard which had fences and ditches. So we're looking here at a multi-compartmented, enclosed environment. And when we're talking and working with some of our veterans, they will quite often say, "This reminds me of the compounds I fought in, or fought through, or fought into in Iraq or Afghanistan." And it's at that time when you get the interface of the past and the present, and somebody who has done the same work that you're investigating, that things really start to fall together in an almost magical way. I've always said that archaeology is the closest thing we have to a time machine, and this work at Waterloo is a souped-up time machine, if you like. But what you've got at this end, there were the buildings, the chateau, which was burned down famously during the battle, French howitzer shell probably, the barns, the south gate, the north gate up there, the walled garden, which was defended, loopholed, 7 or 8 foot high brick wall. These 3 chestnut trees are the only survivors of a quite complex wooded landscape that sat to the south of Hougoumont. And it was through this wooded arboreal complex that the first fighting took place. There were skirmishers out there defending the position, and the French fighting their way through it. And we were looking at certain aspects of this battle in the wood this year with some quite startling results. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss those tonight. But these 3 chestnut trees are the last survivors of that wood. Most of it was cut down within 2 to 3 years of the battle because the trees were peppered with musket shots and cannonballs. Unfortunately, over the last 2 or 3 years, the middle one fell down. It was dead anyway. 2 are dead. They were hit by lightning. But the one at the end is still alive. And they are pot-marked with musket shot. If you put a metal detector up against the trunks, it will go off because it is carrying lead. But this area here was entirely covered. Right up to the end of the wall there was entirely covered with woodland. The best way to get an impression of that is to look at some historical mapping. But the first area we're going to look at is this gap between the field, which marked the edge of the wood, which would also have had a hedge along it, and the wall, which which you can't see much of here because of the trees, but you will do. That 30-metre gap, about 130 metres long, became known after the battle as the killing ground, thanks to the number of French dead found at the base of the wall. And we obviously have this famous painting. I'm not going to go into this, but this is the defence of Hougoumont. If you've seen one image of the Battle of Hougoumont, it is probably this one, the Coldstream Guards and the Scots Guards closing the gates. And this is Wellington's famous quote, that closing the gates of Hougoumont saved the day. The thing is that, yes, around 30 to 35 French soldiers got in. This is one of only 4 or 5 French incursions into Hougoumont, one of which we've discovered archaeologically. It's not really recorded at all in the historical accounts. And this is Ferrara's map from 1777, when this was the Austrian Netherlands. A superbly detailed map, which again gives you some insight into the nature of the complex and the worked landscape around it, which includes this area of woodland to the south. All gone now. So that's this area here. And this is Crane's map, official cartographer from the area, from the Brabant originally. And this is published in 1816, and it shows the battle underway. So you can see the defenders in blocks of red in the wood and the French in blue attacking from the south. Eventually fighting their way right the way through the wood, and then encountering, and probably only then seeing for the first time, the fact that there is a defended farm beyond it with high walls and buildings. That was their next obstacle. So you can forget anything like scaling ladders and such like to get over these walls. Doesn't like that. It's that Glaswegian PowerPoint. So the killing ground I was talking about is this strip here. So we've got the brick wall there with the garden behind it. It's really bizarre to imagine these soldiers running around in high duress, killing and fighting in an ornate garden. Imagine fighting a battle in a National Trust property. Oh, there are a few of those going on, aren't there? Better not see. So here we are in what was the killing ground. You've got the wall in the background. One of the things we discovered archaeologically was that the wall you see there today was not standing there in 1815. This has been rebuilt at least on 3, 4, 5 occasions. We found the original foundations. They are underneath it. But if you have a 7 or 8 foot high brick wall that's about 130 metres long, it's going to drag itself down by its own weight, if nothing else. So this has been rebuilt. The loopholes that you see today, forget them. They bear no resemblance whatsoever to what was knocked through there with pickaxes and bayonets in 1815. But we are here detecting the ground at the front. So this is the killing ground, and each one of those flags you see there with our detectorists is a musket ball. Now the great thing about this period, archaeologically speaking, is that we can tell who fired what, within reasonable bounds. And I knew this from having worked at the battlefield of Culloden from 1746. And believe it or not, the musketry technology was exactly the same in 1815. It's a very slow period. It speeds up very quickly after Waterloo, but up until then, it's very slow. But the point to take away is that the brown vest, which is used by a lot of Wellington's troops, is .75 caliber. And the French equivalent, the Charleville musket ball, is .69. The takeaway there is that the French musket ball is slightly smaller than the Allied. So we can, within reasonable bounds, say who fired what, which is very useful. These are not boring spheres of lead. And as you can see, there's damage on...
Just do the left click.
Is it this remote that's doing it? I'm just gonna use the keyboard then.
Yeah.
They're not just spheres of lead. We've now got to the point where we can, well, for one thing, we can source the lead using isotope analysis, but we can also, using experimentation, start to look at how these what these projectiles hit. And in my own department, we have 3 Brown Bess muskets and a 3-pound cannon. Our students can't quite believe that when they arrive, but there you go. But here are wonderful illustrations by Collingwood of the defenders behind the wall shooting through it and over it, the French crossing the killing ground, and here we have the opposite view. Now, this is a close-up. This gives you an idea of why it's called the killing ground. This is by a British artist called Dennis Dighton, who was commissioned by the Prince Regent to take a graphic record of the battle, obviously pre-photography. Dighton was there for about 5 days immediately after the battle, and in the 1820s he turned his wonderful sketches into a series of paintings. And this is the background to one of them, and you'll see a fuller version of this later, but you can see here the naked bodies of French soldiers lying at the foot of the wall, which stretches 130 metres or so that way. So you get an impression of the carnage that must have remained in this area after the battle. But what we did was, every musket shot that we found, we recorded its location. And we recorded whether it was French or whether it was Allied, whether it was fired at Hougoumont or from Hougoumont. And what that allowed us to do is to create a forensic snapshot of the battle for that wall. Now this, believe it or not, dramatic as it is a very under-recorded, as far as the history is concerned, part of the battle. We know there are 3 or 4 major French assaults against the wall, but the description on either side are fairly rare. So anything we can do to fill out that picture archaeologically is a plus. And here it's really come to fruition. So what you've got against the base of the wall are concentrations of French musket balls. So what we can do is we can identify locations that have been deliberately targeted by French assault groups as they come out of the wood and into that open area. And likewise, in the other direction, we've got red shot, we've got defender's shot, which is starting to give the impression of bunching up in small areas. Now, our problem is that we haven't yet got into this area because there's always a crop here. But if we metal detected here, we would have a very complete picture. What I think we're looking at here is areas which have been absolutely pounded with musket shot prior to escalade, that is, attempts to climb the wall. And likewise, the Allies are probably targeting holes, gaps in the fence, in the hedge, where the French are coming through. So we're here picking up the choreography of the battle, which is absent from any of the accounts. The other thing is, you will see there are blue and red markers inside the garden. That is the evidence for a close quarter firefight which took place within the precincts of the garden. Not major, but some French troops got in. The Anglo accounts tend to be, there's no way the French got into the garden, not a single Frenchman got in there. They did get in there. They got over that down the wall somehow. So that to it's a piece of work I'm really proud of. Stuart Eve, my colleague, and myself have written a paper on that, which is available as an open access download if you want to go into the detail of it. But I just wanted to give you an impression of the sort of thing that the archaeology, and when people think about battlefield archaeology, they tend to think about musket balls and metal detectors. But if we look at the wider world of conflict archaeology, then we start to really have the ability to examine the world within which this battle was fought. We're going to flick to Mont Saint-Jean, which is marked by the red star at the top there. Now, this again is a courtyarded farm, readily defendable, less so in this case because it's only got 3 sides to it. But it is behind the line, though, as you can see from that image, which is by James Rouse, you can see that it's been pretty battered about during the battle, and we have the process of burial taking place just in front of it. But if you go there today, that view will be familiar, because that's what it looks like today. Now, it's undergone renovation, but it's still there, still beside the road. It's now very usefully a brewery. So you can go and buy your Wellington beer there, and it's thanks to Anthony, who owns the brewery, that we've had permission to work on his ground, which is, as the Americans would say, hallowed ground, as you'll see. So there is a Google Earth image. You were looking at the frontage from the road. You can see it's had a lot of additions. In fact, this big restaurant is a very new addition. But you get the idea of an open-backed courtyard. We are in the orchard at the back, which at the time of the battle, certainly according to Ferrara's map, was an open field. And the yellow star there is indicating the site that would the focus for excavation that we're going to look at now. We were metal detecting that area, and one of the detectorists says, "I found a bone." So what setting have you got your metal detector on? The thing was that person had found a bone, and it threw up a signal because it was lying on a piece of metal, on a piece of tin. So archaeologists went in and they carefully excavated that area. And what we uncovered after, this was 2019, so after years of not finding anything at all akin to a body disposal site, a burial pit, a cremation mound, here we had human remains, but a very specific type of human remain. What we're looking at here are 3 amputated human legs. Now, this didn't come as a huge surprise beyond that, given that Mont Saint-Jean was known to be Wellington's main field hospital. And Mick Cromplin, a surgery expert from the battle and the period, estimates that around 500 limbs, that's arms and legs, probably cut off by field surgeons in the barn just across the lane from where this discovery was made. I was doing work on Glasgow University, my own institution, and its experience during the First World War, and through that work discovered that around 20 field surgeons who served at Waterloo got some sort of training at Glasgow University, which still today is renowned for its medical college. So what we have here are 3 legs that have been sawn off without the aid of anaesthetic or antibiotics or any form of modern assistance. We do not know whether the men who had these limbs removed, and if you were shot by one of those heavy musket balls in one of your extremities, amputation was 9 times out of 10 the only answer. We don't know whether they survived, but their limbs certainly went. And we do know that soldiers did survive these horrific injuries. Now, after careful excavation, these bones went to our colleagues' laboratory in Brussels, and they are still undergoing analysis. You can see there the metal, the rusting heap of metal that they're lying on top of, which gave away their position. We'll come back to that. But one thing that became apparent when the bones were actually carefully lifted was that one of them had embedded within it a fragment of French musket ball. So you saw those musket balls previously, they were still spherical, fairly intact. Here you've got one that's fragmented. And if a musket ball hits the bone, there's every chance it will fracture into 2, 3 or multiple pieces. You can imagine the damage that causes both to bone and tissue. So here we actually have the physical evidence of the reason for that amputation. What we also encountered while doing that work, those limbs are beneath that white tent that you see there. But just a bit further down, as ever on an archaeological excavation, just poking out of the section were some animal teeth. And there's Stu pointing at them. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to do anything else. The 2019 season was finishing. We were fairly sure, well, we were tossing around the item, is it cow or is it horse? But the money was on the horse, as my friend the bookie would say. And so we backfilled all of this carefully. The human limbs were removed. And could not wait to get back there in 2020 to continue work on what was already a fairly unique site as far as Napoleonic battlefields are concerned. But fate intervened. And for 2 years we did not return to the battlefield. And I won't say I was twiddling my thumbs, because I do have a day job, as my students will tell you. But it gave me the opportunity to start to think about what we were doing, what problems we were facing, and why, for one thing, had we not yet encountered graves. This is a battle within which the working numbers at the moment, and I'm constantly stressing about these, are upwards of 20,000 human losses. That's killed in action on the field. That figure goes between 10 and 20,000. I'm looking at Gettysburg at the moment. I think 20,000 might be slightly over egging the pudding, but I'm not here to talk about that. But also, probably, 10,000 horses died in this battle. Why had we not found their remains? So what I did during this 2-year hiatus in the programme was I hit the books. I started to use the history part of my head. And I started to look at early visitor accounts of those who went to the site, either as pilgrims or tourists or relatives in the immediate aftermath of the battle. And I'm largely here talking about civilian accounts. Now, some of these are very well known. We can recap the names involved. We've got, very famously, Sir Walter Scott, who visited in August of 1815, when most of the battlefield had been cleared of its dead and a lot of the debris that was lying on it. My favourite is probably Charlotte Eaton, who visits on the 15th of July, so just under a month, around a month after the battle, she visits. She was actually in Brussels on the eve of the battle. She was visiting. She knew there was going to be a battle. This was the magnetic draw it had, so she was drawn to Brussels. So she was around when the famous ball was happening. But she ultimately, I think after putting it off for a while, she visited anywhere but, I'll go to the military hospital at Antwerp, but ultimately she visited Waterloo and she wrote a fabulous account. Very Gothic. Let's not forget, this is the period that gave us Frankenstein. Byron himself visited sometime later. A wonderful account, but they are legion. So I went through each and every one of these, the familiar, the unfamiliar, and I started to basically record data from them. And I was interested in two things. One was, how was the battlefield cleared of the debris? All of the clothing, all of the armour, the muskets, the swords. Where did that go? The other thing was, what happened to the bodies, both human and animal? And I started to strip out what I was regarding as data from all of these different accounts. And it was quite clear that there were overlaps, that people were talking about the same thing. They were talking about the same burial pit just outside of La Haye-Saint, or in the orchard at Huguemont. And I started to plot all of that. But then the icing on the cake came when Moira Rankin, who's archivist at the University of Glasgow, said, we've just had an accession of a set of private family papers into the university library, and one of them is a set of papers from a Glaswegian merchant who was living in Brussels at the time of the battle. So I went to look at that, and they included a chapbook, basically almost a scrapbook. And it was his copying out of a lot of famous articles. Wellington's Dispatch, Ney's letter, it wasn't my fault letter. A lot of that stuff that appears in what is very quickly a subgenre of military writing. And it very quickly turns into the guidebook as we understand it today. And this is accompanied, this is sent to his nephew in Glasgow, that's why it survived, and he said in a letter accompanying it, here's my book on Waterloo, on the battle. I would like you, if you can, without cost to yourself, to get it published. the wonderful thing is, because he wanted it published, he's written it in a legible hand. You can actually read the thing. But that never happened. It went in a trunk along with the letters and was forgotten about until it was put in Glasgow University, and I was in there like a rat up a drain pipe. And it took me 3 pages of this thing to realise that this was a revelation. It took me a bit longer to realise how much of a revelation. What this chap, Thomas Kerr, who first visited, he's not explicit, but it's quite clear if you excavate his text, he was there the day after the battle. He'd come down from Brussels, and he was on the field the day after. He was giving water to soldiers, wounded soldiers who died in his arms. And never mind the artists. There's his work. And he says in his letters that within the year after the battle, he visits the battlefield 18 times. There are 2 things here about Thomas Kerr. He is the first civilian to visit the battlefield and write about his experiences that we know about. Everybody else that we know about has had their experiences published. And they were there way after him. Weeks, if not months after him. He was there the day after the battle. Not only that, but he visited 18 times. And unfortunately, he doesn't write about, it's not like a diary, he doesn't write about every occasion. You've kind of got to work out what's going on. But I think what happens is, and it's clear from the tone of his writing, he traumatizes himself by visiting the battlefield. He has what we would call today PTSD. And his repeated visits to the battlefield, and also Quatre Bras, which took place 2 days before, are a means of therapy. And it's a known therapy. This exposure therapy is used today to salve PTSD. And I think, without knowing it, that's what he's doing. Because as he visits on these occasions, month after month, what he's seeing is the landscape and the place healing itself. First, the bodies are removed. Then the debris is removed. Then more of the debris is removed. Until ultimately, that site has pretty much healed itself. He's still collecting material, and he's sending material to his family in Glasgow. Now, I don't have time to go into what becomes an industry in souvenir collection and sale. There is an economy based on this at Waterloo. If you're a local, you're going to want some return for the cost of probably your private property and your land. And that comes in the form of tourists who you start to guide around the battlefield and to sell souvenirs to. And just to give you an extract, this is to a letter to his nephew in Glasgow, 7th of February 1817. The cuirass I bought from the field of Waterloo, that is to say from the door of La Belle Alliance, some days after the battle, all over blood, which is, letters torn, it and forms a varnish, and keeps it from rust. It stunk for a month after I had it. I hope that you will never part with it, letter torn again, it to remain in our family as a memento. So he is sending an object from a battle which his family, as far as we know, have no direct links to the fighting, but they crave artifacts from it and have requested a cuirass, which is undoubtedly the Rolls Royce of souvenirs, and we would say trophy, from the battlefield of Waterloo. And there is a wonderful Denis Dighton painting with La Belle Alliance at the back there, the building at the back, which becomes the first souvenir shop. And you've got locals who were contracted the day after the battle, at least 100 of them, to bury the dead. And this process takes at least 10 days. I've mapped this through the accounts. And here you have this chap here stripping. And everything was stripped, apart from the socks of the Scots, apparently, for some reason. There's a close-up. And when we talk about a cuirass, that's what it is. It's the front and back breastplate of French heavy cavalry. It's regarded as the premier totemic trophy from the battlefield. Sir Walter Scott went hugely out of his way to get them, to get examples. He writes about Highland troops frying their mutton in these, using them as a skillet. Now, I suggested initially, I thought he was making that up. I've just come across an account from a Scottish soldier from Lanarkshire who describes doing exactly that. So there's Dennis Dighton again. That is the north gate, the south gate at Hougoumont. That's the close-up of the French in the killing ground I showed you before. But what you can see there is a burial pit with naked bodies and accoutrements. So we've got knapsacks, shakots, cartridge belts and pouches. That's all French kit. So these are French guys that have probably come from up and down the wall. And they're just being unceremoniously dumped in a pit. We've explored this area, geophysics and excavation. My colleague Tim Sutherland did geophysics there many years ago. We excavated that area at the instruction of the local authority. No trace whatsoever of the grave. So what's happened to it? Is this purely artistic license, or has this grave kind of disappeared? And also by James Rouse, who's slightly more primitive. In some respects, I even like his work more. Same place, same activity, but they're not burying, they're burning. And we have accounts. Thomas Kerr talks about them burning the dead. There's one account which says if the timber was drier, we'd have burnt more of them because it saved labour. It's really hard to burn a human body. So, returning, I did all of that, churned it around, put out 2 papers, realised I could have written a book rather than put out 2 papers, but that's the plight of the academic. And then we went back last year to Mont Saint-Jean to return to that site which we'd all been thinking about for 2 years under lockdown. And there is the location, there's the farm on Ferrara's map. And what I thought, the working model I'd come up with was that there was a trackway, which is still there today. Our finds in a ditch were right next to the trackway, and it's on the map there. You can see the road behind the farm. And I thought, what we've got here is just a roadside ditch. Somebody has come along after the battle and cleared up the debris from the hospital and dumped it in this roadside ditch, which meant that there could be stuff all the way along this ditch, all the way along this road. There's an amazing account by I think it's a guy in the Royal Scots Greys. Scott, again, visits Mont Saint-Jean the day after the battle, describes in the middle of the courtyard a mound of arms and legs. Horrific sight. But this is the clear-up operation. So that was my working hypothesis. It was wrong. As I always am. So there we have that trace alongside the track and our find spot. So the first thing we did was we carefully re-excavated the area we were working on pre-COVID. There you can see the team set to work. Those horse bones are, I think that's them there, coming to light. Obviously we'd removed those legs. What about those bits of metal that the legs were lying on? They turned out to be the highly denuded tin liners of ammunition pouches. Each one of these pouches, which virtually every soldier had, depending on whether you were French, the ones you saw in that previous picture, that painting, were French. These are Allied. There's a reenactor version. These are basically the waterproofing for your paper cartridges with your powder and ball in this leather pouch. What they've done, they would obviously take all of this stuff off. If you need attention, the first thing the surgeon needs to see is your wound. All clothing comes off and it's ripped off. These obviously come off. These are unslung. I think what we're seeing here, and this only came to me this week, why are we just seeing the liners? There are no buckles. Obviously the leather would have decayed. But why are there no buckles or badges off this piece of equipment that we've got, maybe half a dozen and more examples of? I think what they're doing is they're stripping out the liners because they haven't got an immediate use for them, and they might be messy with watered down powder, which makes horrible mush. And they're keeping the pouches. The pouches are bags. They have an instant use. So what you've got here is a byproduct of the on-site processing of army surplus, which will then be traded. There, just to remind you, is a Denis Dighton image of the French with exactly the same thing being pulled out. So who knows whether the tin boxes that were in those pouches went into that grave pit. As I say, we didn't find that grave pit. It was a horse. It wasn't one horse, it was 4 horses, lying nose to tail, each of which had horrific injuries to the leg bones. There are some staggering descriptions. There's another Scot called Patterson who writes about wandering the field the day after the battle. A horse turns around to face him, and he sees then it only has 3 legs. And he said, it's to my regret to this very day that I did not have only a pistol at that moment to put that horse out of its misery. Imagine that hundreds of times over. Those horses that weren't killed outright. What we discovered was each one of these horses has a musket ball in its skull. Looks like, what we've not got is a roadside ditch. What we do have is a deliberately dug, flat-bottomed, shallow killing pit, where they have walked the horses in, those that are capable of it, left them in position, and shot them in the head. It's euthanasia. It's putting these animals out of their misery. So to one side of these amputated human limbs, we have horses nose to tail. Quite staggering, really. And again, unique. We have Napoleonic battlefields where we have horse burials. We don't have a Napoleonic pit with horse burials and amputated human bones in it. But that wasn't the end of the story. On the other side of the amputated legs, we had our first complete inhumation of a body. This is only the second human body to be excavated by archaeologists at Waterloo. We know now that this chap is very gracile, very slight. That is another human leg of a much sturdier character lying next to him. In his early 20s. We don't know how he died. There is no sign of musket shot or cannon shot damage to bones. We don't know whether he died on the surgeon's table or whether he died in the battlefield nearby and was brought to this place to be buried. Looks as though from his position, there's been some care in the placement of the body, probably under the arms and the legs. He's been placed in the grave on his back. So that was a quite amazing return to that locale. Again, that was where work ceased. This year we didn't go back there because we need to build up capacity to get back to that area again. But that work is incomplete. I'm totally confident that there are more horses to the north and more human bodies to the south. And again, this isn't just a burial pit. This is a burial complex. This is a phenomenal thing we're looking at here. But it's all we've got. 20,000 dead humans, 10,000 dead horses. Where are they all? Well, I started at this point during COVID to look at the old accounts about bones being dug up for fertiliser. And it's largely been written off by some historians as an urban myth. It is not. But there's very little about it at Waterloo. I mean, even Gettysburg, they were doing this. But there's very little direct evidence in the documentary record other than a few contemporary newspaper accounts and the accounts of mills in Scotland where these bones were ground up with the phosphates and they'd be spread. Very good for turnips. So I thought, well, surely this has had an impact. We would have found more graves. I was then contacted by 2 colleagues, Dr. Bernard Wilkin, a Belgian, an archivist in the Belgian State Archives, and a German historian, Rob Schaffer. And they had, in tandem with me looking at this fertiliser thing, Bernard had come up with local authority, gendarmerie and mayor's accounts of paperwork relating to the 1830s. What we have encountered is quite a phenomenon. We probably have removal of bones for fertiliser in the 1820s. That's me mapping grave sites from eyewitness accounts. That's my working map. What we get in the 1830s is a total change in the nature of the agriculture. We turn over from a very mixed arable agriculture into a monoculture. And that monoculture is based on sugar beet. There is a massive upsurge in the use of sugar. Certainly the discovery that sugar beet can be grown in Europe and sources overseas, obviously highly based around slavery, do not need to be utilised. But if you use sugar beet and just basically get the sugar from it, it's brown, it's ugly, it's not marketable. But if you refine it, you can turn it into the white sugar that we know today. But to do that, you need to filter it through a substrate. The most effective substrate, it was discovered across Europe at this time in various locations, is charred bone. Basically, you cremate bone in a kiln, and then you use it as a filter layer, and you put the juice from the sugar beet through it, and the end result is lovely white sugar that people enjoy putting in their tea and coffee. And this was a massive business. Loads of the forestry, loads of the woods around Hougoumont, including Hougoumont woods, around Waterloo are cut down so the fields can be used for the planting of sugar beet. You get the building of kilns to process bones into char, bone char, and also sugar refineries. This is a portrait of a sugar refinery in the town of Waterloo. It's actually showing the battlefield in the immediate background. There's artistic license there. But this is an incredibly accurate rendition of this sugar refinery in the town of Waterloo. And in fact, we know that because some of us have eaten in the restaurant in that building there, because it's now a hotel. But this is the industry which was to change the face of the battlefield. And what you get is all of those graves, all of those dead horses, all of those dead men dug up and used as bone char. And we have the documentation to back it up. Now, when I say all, that's hyperbole. It's clearly not all. There are mass graves on the battlefield still intact. I'm now exploring the reasons why some of them are still intact. I think I've got a good idea. Don't have time to go into that any further, but that really is the punchline to this preamble. That is the story that unlocks a lot of what we faced at Waterloo as archaeologists. Thank you very much.
Well, what a way to end. Tony, thank you so very much for taking us through this extraordinary account of your work at Waterloo. It's been really fascinating and at times stomach-churning as well. So I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions out in the audience for you. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So if anyone does have anything they'd like to ask Tony, please put your hand up and someone will come and hand you a microphone. Yes, at the back in the middle there. Better with a microphone.
Yes, thank you. It was fascinating. One thing you didn't mention was any sort of accompanying train for the soldiers, to serve the soldiers, a sort of wagon train of suppliers, of people selling wares, doing washing, all this sort of thing that used to follow some of them.
There would have been, these armies moved with massive victualers trains and camp followers. And there are actually, within the accounts, there are a number of descriptions of female corpses on the battlefield. And there are various ideas which the observers put to that. One was this somebody looting a body, somebody still wounded and they've shot them? Another is that they're actually combatants. And there is one amazing description of a French cuirassier, one of these heavy cavalrymen wearing the armour, being stripped of the armour and It's actually a woman. So we're only scratching the surface here. So yeah, there's a heck of a lot of stuff I didn't have time to mention here. I mean, we've got Waterloo teeth. We've got the production of fake artifacts within a decade or so of the battle because they're running out of supplies. Yeah. There's a factory in Liège making this stuff to sell to tourists as genuine, and in some cases they're even burying it and digging it up.
Yes. If I might ask, I was leading on to a question though about what would have happened immediately after the battle, or even at the end of the battle, during the battle, because I'd be surprised if a lot of these people, knowing the value of such artifacts, weren't on the battlefield like a shot, stripping everything they could get. So that might explain.
Kind of the impression I wanted to give.
Yes,
The soldiers don't hang around. The Prussians hover a bit and become highwaymen in some cases. The locals are out there like a shot. I mean, there's one account which is absolutely hyperbolic, which says every dead soldier was stripped naked within 24 hours of the battle. They weren't. It took. The battle is fought on to give you a timeline. The battle is fought on a Sunday. There are still wounded on the field on the Wednesday and the Thursday. There's a surgeon who says writes on the Thursday, the last of the wounded will be removed today. The burial or burning of the dead takes at least 10 days. But the collection of the debris, which includes everything from copies of Voltaire, the Bible, packs of playing cards, personal possessions, all of the military accoutrement, all of the clothing, some of that is there for years after. And it becomes an industry. And I haven't had time to show you, but there are wonderful Rouse and Dighton paintings of visitors coming into the small village of Waterloo, and locals rushing to them with handfuls of stuff to sell them. And it just becomes, and the early guidebooks, which start to appear in about the 1830s onwards, there's a flurry of them around 1850, they start to complain about the harassment that British visitors are getting from local people trying to tout their wares. So yeah, I mean that's very much the picture. This place was just 2 miles by 2 miles, people all over it. The soldiers leave fairly early. The looting begins before the battle's over. Soldiers are emptying one another's pockets while the fighting's still on.
Thank you. Yeah.
It can be quite controversial, the unearthing of skeletons from battlefields when there isn't a threat of development for the site. What is happening to these skeletons? This one skeleton that your group has
well, there's a flurry. We've actually, what we've discovered since the archaeological excavation of that skeleton is that there are a lot of human remains in private hands. Over the years, in places like Planchenoir, which is a village which was heavily fought over late in the day by the Prussians and the French, building projects years ago, skulls and long bones have been recovered. They've just gone into garden sheds or attics. And our work and the work of Robert Bernard on the sugar beet has encouraged people to come forward and surrender these remains. So it's kind of opened a Pandora's box, but we're at the moment. There's as ever there is a committee now where we're discussing what is the most suitable end place and end story for these remains. And I can't, given the experience of a lot of those people involved in this project, I can't tell you the heightened emotion which is present among the team. And we have a fantastic world-class mental health and well-being team, because clearly trauma is an issue. And some of this material is obviously disturbing and can trigger trauma. We had a double amputee veteran from Afghanistan working with Gary on the metal detecting, just in the field next door to where these legs were. We were very concerned about what his attitude would be. He's lost both legs, here are legs in the ground. Counterintuitively, he actually took away from it a really positive message. He was there living his full life with high-tech artificial limbs, having the time of his life with Gary, digging up musket balls, looking at the remains of a similar action, at least on the human body 200 years previously, and going, I'm glad I lost my legs when I did, and not back then. I wouldn't be doing this now. I'd probably be dead. The shock would have probably killed me. So it impacts different people in different ways. But I've wanted for a long time. I've done a lot of work on human. I've exhumated. I led the team that discovered the biggest mass grave from the First World War, discovered since the 1920s for the Australian government in France. And I don't take that work lightly, but it got to the point where I wanted to find human remains, because what I wanted to push back against, and what Waterloo Uncovered generally pushes back against, is the boys' own take on the Battle of Waterloo. The Jeremy Clarkson Top Gear, isn't it great we beat the French? Rubbish. This was a real battle. This was hell on earth. And human remains help to remind people that was the reality.
Just a quick question. Thomas Kerr's letters and papers, when are they going to be published?
Yeah, well, I have published everything. I mean, it was a great privilege to be able to fulfil his ambition 200 plus years after. But in a paper which I can also provide you with the reference for, it's again a free download, I published all of the extracts which I thought were directly related to the battle, but there's a lot more. And I'm pleased to say that about 3 weeks ago, Special Collections at Glasgow University released the digitised total collection. So you can. I've yet to get to the link, but in theory you can now read. And as I said, his writing is legible because he wanted it printed. He wanted other people to read it. So it's a huge privilege to be. And when I was doing the press at the time over that, I kept saying, he's the first that we know about that's unpublished. People might have letters and chapbooks and in their attics and wherever their garage is. If you do have, written by whoever, an account by a veteran or an early visitor of Waterloo, or any other battle, to be quite frank, I've become really. I inhabit, as an archaeologist working in conflict, I inhabit a place called Aftermath. I mean, that's my reality, is what happens after these events. I can't be there, but I inhabit part of the aftermath. I'm still part of the story. And I've become really fascinated now. I mean, I'm going to Vietnam early next year to start to look at similar stories there.
It was the same question.
What happens to that person?
Perfect. Any further questions? Yes, over here. Last one, I'm afraid.
Well, I was going to ask, we know that the Battle of 1815 wasn't the first time that the whole site and area had been fought over. In particular, I'm thinking about 1794. Is there any traces being found of those previous occasions? Because, I mean, one of the myths of Battle of Waterloo was it was wonderfully noted as a defensive position when it was well known that of its defensive.
Well, it was actually Marlborough, I think, in about 1706, first writes about its defensive capabilities when he's resident in Fishermont on Wellington's left. But yeah, but you're right. There is an earlier, late 18th century battle which takes in Waterloo and parts of it, and it does impact to a degree on Hougoumont, and we're hoping that lead isotope analysis will be one way of helping us. If there is a palimpsest of, and we can't assume that every musket ball we pick up from Waterloo is from the Battle of Waterloo. It's not, as you say, it's not the only battle to have multiple actions on the same site. The only site to have multiple battles on it. But we're also working with French historians and Belgian historians on teasing apart the accounts, because it is kind of on the outskirts of that battle. But it's a very good question, and obviously it's, again, being an archaeologist, it's another fly in the damned ointment.
Thank you very much, Tony. That's, I'm afraid, all we've got time for. But perhaps you'll join me again in thanking Tony for a fantastic 34th lecture. Tony? And I will now hand over back to the Vice Chancellor. Thank you.
Can I get a picture of everyone? I'll get you to sign a release form before I Thank you all for coming.
So, if I can just add my thanks, it was, I mean, one of the great privileges of being the Vice-Chancellor is that you get to be invited to a whole range. I'm doing AI and artificial intelligence and the effect it's going to have on society tomorrow. So, you know, you can see the very wide range of things that universities do, but tonight was a fantastic example of the a kind of way that academia really throws a light on the kind of, in this case, the past. So thank you very, very much for that. Huge privilege. Now, there are two things that the Wellington lecture seeks to do. One, the main event, which we've just had, but the second is to present the Wellington Prize. Now, the Wellington Prize is something that is sponsored by the Duke, and we're very grateful again for his support of that. And a brief history of it is we look to work going on by either postgraduate or undergraduate students here at the University of Southampton who are studying for a University of Southampton qualification that has elements in the general area of Iberian studies or military history or political history or government, there are 3 Ors there, of the 18th and 19th centuries. And it effectively looks for the student who in the last period has made the most notable contribution in the opinion of the panel that actually judges this. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce the Duke himself, who will announce and present the prize. Your Grace.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, yet again, I'm so honoured and delighted to have been able to come to the Wellington lecture. I've missed very few of them in the last 34 years. Indeed, this evening's lecture was, for me, and I think for everyone, completely fascinating. Of course, I know about Waterloo Uncovered because when it was being created, Mark Evans came to Apsley House and asked me if I would be patron of the charity, and I was delighted to do so. And it's given me great pleasure to see the charity develop over the last 9 years, I think, 8 years. It's the work that they do, particularly the way they take veterans and indeed serving wounded soldiers to the battlefield is wonderful. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of therapy for many people who are suffering terrible traumas. So I'm really delighted that the university invited Professor Pollard to speak this evening, because he has led nearly all of that archaeological work. However, having said that and expressed my appreciation for the lecture, I am very, very pleased to this evening present the Wellington Prize. As the Vice-Chancellor said, it is for a piece of academic work done about particularly military history in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this year's thesis is a very, very interesting subject, which I must admit I knew absolutely nothing about until I read not all, but a good part of this piece of work. And it's all about the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean, which was considered an important asset of the French Empire. It was taken from the French on many occasions, but subsequently surrendered at the subsequent peace treaty following that particular period of war between France and Britain. But it's very, very interesting. The most interesting piece I picked up right at the beginning of looking at it is that during the American War of Independence, when Britain was trying to save the American colonies, they were prepared, the British government were prepared to divert 5,000 soldiers from around New York to go down to the Caribbean with, I can't remember how many ships, to capture St. Lucia. Extraordinary, probably misjudged diversion of resource, which may well have in the end contributed to the defeat of the British in North America. However, a very interesting piece of work, and I'm therefore delighted to be presenting to David Clark this year's Wellington Prize.
So if I could add my congratulations, David, and a very fitting prize. So thank you very much for that. So that is the end of tonight's event. So it just leaves it me to say to you, thank you again for coming. The university puts these events on, but if you didn't come, wouldn't be worth it. It's all there for the audience. So thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your interest in the Wellington Lecture and the university. Again, thank you to Tony for his talk. It was really fascinating, learning a lot about the battle itself. These talks have been very wide-ranging, but one that concentrates on the battle was hugely interesting. And thank you all for coming, and have a safe journey home. Thank you.